Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Clinical Interface Terminology, the Key to Accurate Healthcare Analytics, presented by Intelligent Medical Objects. I'm Jennifer Seaton, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speaker today is Andrew Cantor, Chief Medical Officer, Intelligent Medical Objects. You can read his full bio on the left side of your window, selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. The webcast is being streamed through your computer, so there's no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentation with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the question and answer tab on the left side of your screen. Okay, now let's begin. Andrew, please go ahead.
Hi. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on where you are. It's a real pleasure to be able to talk with you today. I'm the Chief Medical Officer for IMO and have been with the company pretty much since its founding in 1994. And so we're going to be talking about the informatics and analytics space from the perspective of the underlying data. And why should IMO really be talking about this? Well, we're really the innovator of clinical interface terminology. Although we didn't coin the term, we've certainly been the primary proponent of using clinical interface terminology in health information systems, and now really represent most of the US market with over 500,000 physicians using us daily, the majority of the acute care and primary care settings, in addition to many of the English-speaking countries globally. And why we're going to talk about clinical terminology is that informatics and analytics, regardless of what your use case is, whether you're interested in primarily serving care management processes or clinical care, whether you're using it for revenue cycle management, or perhaps research in the life sciences, all depends upon this foundation of data and how the information is collected. And each of those individual use cases are built upon a common language, which is often having to be built up from many different data sources. And so we know that data is being collected not only from the EHRs themselves, but through all of these other sources of data within a health information ecosystem. So again, talking about clinical interface terminology, I want to give a little bit of a background as to why it's important and specifically how it's relevant to analytics. So if we think about the challenges that healthcare has posed to the providers and the information systems over time, we can roll back the clock a little bit to the 90s when, frankly, EHRs were kind of glorified billing systems, and that much of the terminology and language was familiar to coders. And there weren't a lot of clinical users who were collecting the data on which we were going to be doing our analytics. And it really was because clinical interface terminology was able to make that information in those information systems more accessible to clinicians that we were able to see the much more marked increase in usability by the actual clinical users, and therefore the kind of data that was being collected. Clinical interface terminology actually represents a bridge between what's actually going on within the clinicians' heads and the kind of structured data that computer systems like to talk in. And whether the use case is an administrative revenue cycle one or a more research or clinical one, computers don't talk in analog form. They talk in codes. And so what clinical interface terminology did was create a set of user-friendly, clinically friendly terminology that providers and physicians would easily recognize within the information system and be able to collect that data at the right level of specificity that they needed to be able to take care of the patient. And so you have an example here, whether it's ST elevation, myocardial infarction, or STEMI. There may be multiple different ways that someone would say that underlying concept. That would be stored within the electronic health record or information system, and that the interface terminology would then do all the work necessary to assign the appropriate codes depending on the particular use case or country that you might happen to be working in. Offloading that burden of having to think like a coder from the clinician to the information system itself. Now, when it comes to analytics, it's really important to recognize that information that's being collected at the point of care is frequently not at that level of specificity of the codes. And so taking as an example, something that would be very relevant to a clinician, breast cancer metastasized to the pelvis, that clinical concept is really important to the care of the patient, but requires multiple different codes to actually fully capture that in the information system. And so you can imagine that a clinician going through their EHR is not going to search for 3 different SNOMED codes or 2 different ICD codes to actually document that concept. And so what the clinical interface terminology does is allow them to say what they want, breast cancer metastasized to pelvis, and have all of those codes automatically come along for the ride. And as you can see, that has really important implications for what initially were the primary use cases of the EHR, namely reimbursement and risk adjustment, but also now to analytics that are involving more research and clinical applications, SNOMED codes. And so even if you're using a different kind of data warehouse, or the data is coming out of the EHR and you're using OMOP or Odyssey, linking together all of the appropriate SNOMED codes and tying them back to the specific concepts that the patient has is something that clinical interface terminology does really well. And that is part of the reason why we've been so successful at penetrating the primary care and acute care markets. But healthcare challenges have continued to evolve, and it really was the HITECH Act and the meaningful use incentives that drove a lot of data collection and EHRs to sort of upgrade their systems. And those were the standardized requirements to essentially add appropriate SNOMED codes to problem lists, or ICD-10 codes, eventually ICD-10-CM codes to the diagnosis list. And it was really because of that those meaningful use incentives that clinical interface terminology sort of was able to bridge between those downstream use cases, interoperability use cases, and yet still retain the high level of granularity necessary to do good analytics. So for example, it's possible for the health information systems to take a clinician's primary diagnosis or problem, and actually knowing what the requirements are for additional specificity for, let's say, billing ICD-10-CM, to actually prompt them for the necessary additional metadata to get down to that fully specified ICD-10-CM code, while yet the clinician was still working in their own mind with the clinical term. Another example of how that can work is in risk stratification. If you know the underlying codes that are associated with the HCC scores, for example, you can combine that with a clinical interface terminology to identify where in the system additional specificity lies. And so if a patient has end-stage renal disease, it's possible to further identify that perhaps they also have a dialysis code that is necessary. And so we're still allowing the clinicians to capture the data that they need to capture for their caring of the patient, but also allowing the information systems themselves to drive the additional specificity where it is appropriate. And that additional specificity, which is appearing in the databases, can really be used for analytics in a way that typically might not be there if that information got lost in the process of moving that data around. But up until about March of 2019, we were really thinking that the next sort of challenges that we were going to be seeing toward our data collection and potentially the use cases that we were using analytics for were going to be around the 21st Century Cures Act. And so, matter of fact, I think President Trump was going to announce it at HIMSS right before that was being canceled because of the COVID pandemic. And so what ended up happening was this additional pressure or design that was part of the 21st Century Cures Act was simply exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. And I want to talk a little bit more about exactly what those key drivers were, because it really impacts the kind of data and the challenges we have with data that we want to address in our approach to our analytics. So in short, the 21st Century Cures Act really was centered around 3 main ideas: that by we could increase innovation and competition within the healthcare space, particularly the health information technology space, that it would be possible to do this by reducing burden on clinicians who were at their wits' end and burning out, and advancing interoperability to make sure that data was available and accessible. And lastly, to promote patient access by really bringing the patients back into the center of the health information system management. So these rules that were released in March essentially could be broken down into kind of two main areas. One, the sort of technical improvement or greasing of the skids for data to be able to flow intelligently from one information system into another. This is the increased interoperability guidelines and dictating such use of things like standards like FHIR to move that patient data around. But they also recognize that part of the reason why data wasn't moving around was because there were these sociological barriers to data sharing, and many providers weren't interested in sharing their data. And so it actually included a set of penalties for information blocking. So leading up to March of 2019, we were really anticipating that this improvement, greasing of the skids, you might say, and decreasing of obstacles was going to lead to a data tidal wave, that there was going to be a dramatic increase in the amount of data that was going to be flowing around within the health ecosystem, and that was going to pose some significant challenges. What we didn't anticipate was that COVID was just going to throw gasoline on this whole situation and demand even more information and put a higher pressure on timing of getting that information out. And it was tremendously impressive and in many ways gratifying to participate in all of the consortiums that pulled up developed both domestically and internationally to really address the COVID problem using the data that we had available. But what it really did was show the gaps that we had and why the 21st Century Cures Act was so important, and that those gaps changed over time. The things that we identified was missing or we needed to work on changed over the pandemic. So if you think about it, the early part of the pandemic, it really was about finding whether or not there was actually a pandemic at all, right? It was, how many patients were actually infected with this virus, and then whether or not we actually had the right resources in place for us to manage that. Did we have enough doctors? Were there enough ventilators available or rooms available to support isolation? But pretty quickly after that, we started to realize that that the data was telling us something different than what we thought, that it wasn't just a respiratory disease, that this was really a systemic disease, and that we were looking at the EHR data and the actual information about this disease to decide, what did we need to be worried about? What are the most likely severe cases of the disease, or who is likely to be severely affected? And then what treatments were going to be most effective, or which ones, like hydroxychloroquine, are not likely to be effective. And so as the people started doing analytics on this data, we recognized that there were real challenges to the interoperability and whether the data was being captured at the right level of specificity. And now it's really all about vaccination. So as we look at the tremendous progress that the country has made, and hopefully soon the rest of the world will be making in immunizing us against COVID-19, that there is a huge backlog of information that's being collected that is somehow going to be need to be rationalized and incorporated so that we can start doing things like asking questions about equity, and did we address and properly protect the patients most at risk from this disease. And that is going to necessitate a real review and analysis of the data that was collected or continues to be collected. And lastly, in alignment with the 21st Century Cures Act, is the Biden administration's focus on ensuring that we have the right infrastructure in place to respond even more effectively the next time this happens. And inevitably, it will happen. And so thinking about how data is collected, whether we're asking the right questions in our information systems, and are we able to analyze the data in an appropriate fashion, to help with the proper treatment and management for even prevention of the next epidemic. So looking at the underlying forces that were pressuring providers, we knew we were significantly challenged by the information system's inherent lack of interoperability, the level of specificity and granularity of that data, and the fact that providers were taking the brunt of the burden of managing the data collection. And so I'm going to pause here and allow us to go into a poll question, and then we'll go to the next phase of the presentation.
Great. So our polling question is, what do you guys think are the major challenges facing health IT users today? We're going to give you about 30 seconds to answer the question. So your options are insufficient resources to deal with COVID-19 and all its fallout, clinician burnout due to poor EHR design. Oh, looks like results are already coming in. A mountain rate of change of regulations, poor data quality or the cost of getting value out of the data, lack of data availability, or other.
So hopefully, as we're sort of looking at these results and taking your real world experience in place, we were at a position where this marked tidal wave of information was going to come crashing down onto our health system, both from the interoperability rules and information blocking penalties associated with the 21st Century Cures Act, the direction focused by the current administration on COVID-19, as well as the experience that we had having to deal with the amount of influx of data associated with the pandemic. And so trying to address this in a way that allows us not to be swamped by the tidal wave, but rather utilize that to power better care and to use the information that we derive out of the data to help us better respond to the challenges that we're facing. So looking here, it looks like poor data quality, the cost of getting data out of data is pretty far the most important result, people think, although there's a little bit of smattering of other choices. And I'm going to talk a little bit about, from our perspective, why do we think that there is this problem of getting value out of the data? And that is, what are the both technological and perhaps sociological fixes that we can bring to our health information systems and our health ecosystem to do a better job of that and to improve in general, not just the health outcomes of the patients, but the quality of life of the providers. So I'm going to start by describing kind of the current paradigm and the challenge that we face. As I mentioned before, electronic health records started out primarily as sort of glorified billing systems and capturing information that was in an encounter. And these traditionally were very silo-based and focused on the EHR itself. And the more data, the better. Then what was typically done was that there would be someone on the back end, oftentimes coders or reimbursement specialists, utilization review, that was responsible for deriving the back end value. And so providers were out there in front collecting the data. Somebody else was responsible for driving the value, and they were out basically left to blindly reach into this electronic health record to find the information that they needed to take care of the patient at that point in time. And this led to a really non-virtuous cycle of data collection that was neither accurate nor collecting the right kind of data because the clinicians weren't getting the benefit out of it. And so I'm going to describe a different sort of paradigm and something that is we can certainly utilize within our existing information systems. And this is that rather than these sort of passive data collection tools, these sort of either file cabinets or kind of a plumbing metaphor of sticking things in a tank and having to reach in and get it out, that health information technology is actually a communication medium. And if we can understand this, the data quality that we're capturing inside that system is going to be much better. What I mean by that is that today, much of our care is actually provided as a team. And so when I'm using the EHR, I'm essentially communicating with the other members of my team via that tool. And so the data that's going into the tool is not simply to go into a bucket, but rather needs to make it to the other members of the team in an understandable way so that they can help me take better care of the patient. Another change that has happened is that the patients and the patients' families are more and more becoming involved with their own care, rightly so. And the patient portals driven by the electronic health records themselves are often the way that the things that I'm entering into my record are being communicated to the patient. And lastly, something that you may not recognize is that as a provider, I'm mostly using the EHR to talk to myself in the future. I'm not going to remember 6 months or a year from now when I see you again what I was really thinking about at the time I saw you last. What was my concerns? What was my diagnostic process or my therapeutic process? What has happened since then? And how does that information come back to me in a way that really helps me take care of the patient? So this paradigm is a really important way to understand the way, as a provider, I'm actually trying to use the health information system. But what the challenge is that if we want to make this system really be a solution for all of the providers that I've mentioned and stakeholders, we have to recognize that the data that I collect at the point of care when I'm taking care of the patient at that moment is not necessarily in the right format for those secondary uses. It's not necessarily fit for those purposes. And something has to happen. That data has to be modified. It has to be aggregated. It has to be normalized. And then it has to be transformed and summarized for each context or purpose to truly unlock the value for the providers and other consumers of that data. And if we do that properly, then that data content, the information content of that data is going to be much more fit for the analytics purposes and for driving the answers to the questions that we want to ask of it. So one way we at IMO looked at this was to try to imagine a data maturity model. Now, many enterprises are familiar with enterprise software maturity models, and they're kind of, this is a useful way to think about progress and being able to map a particular place, a facility or an organization, into their journey toward improvement of whatever it is. And if you look at healthcare data, you know, probably the vast majority of folks are over on the far left. And this is sort of just in the purely data aware state where there's a huge amount of manual effort required to pull data together from multiple different data sources, to custom analyze each and every one of those, to manipulate each of those data streams. And so to get the value, it's highly cost intensive. And the amount of value that you can actually get out of it is relatively low. And on the far right side are those data organizations that are truly data driven. They've got this system down. They are able to drive prescriptive insights and base all of their decision making upon real world data that's coming out of their system. And so in those situations, the data value is extremely high, and the cost of getting information out is generally low because the data is really fit for purpose. And we kind of coined the idea of like gasoline, of octane. And data has, many people think of data sort of as the new oil anyway, but that the data information content and the ability to extract value at a lower cost point is like octane. Just the same way you might get high performance value out of gasoline with higher octane, you want to basically inject octane into your data along the way here so that depending on which part of the life cycle you're in, you can actually maximize the value that you can get from that data. So what we did was we took this notion of what data required for fitness of purpose and mapped it into sort of where people generally are on this data quality improvement process. And so the first part we talked about was data collection, because it is not possible, if the data is not collected properly, to actually get information through the system in a high octane format. So data, once collected, has to be brought together from all these different systems, as I've talked about before. Once it's together, the data needs to speak the same language. And this is one of the big challenges we have right now, is that the data as it's collected is collected very differently from different systems. And we don't really know what is in that data. And we don't know when that data is clean or dirty. By creating data in the same language, it really allows us to now apply some form of assessment as to the quality of that data, and perhaps actually improve that quality of the data, so that we can then enrich it by allowing that data, once clarified, to actually relate to other data elements, to draw inferences, and hopefully power some of the super future hopes that we have, like artificial intelligence and so on. So another way to look at this is that data goes on a journey, and depending on where you're on this journey, you'll get better or worse effects in your analytics. So as I mentioned before, there's this aggregation step. So no matter how that data is being collected, and as I mentioned before, clinical interface terminology is the best way to do that, because you're guaranteeing the highest level of clinical specificity and retaining clinical intent. But as it's coming in from all these different systems, whether it's being sent through HL7 FHIR 2.0 or in document format, that data is going to be aggregated and put into a central location, whether it's the EHR, Clinical Data Warehouse, or HIE. Making that data all speak the same language and normalized is the next step. And that is has to be done at the highest level of specificity. If what happens is what generally happens now, is that that data is aggregated and normalized at the sort of lowest common denominator, in this case, like a billing code, then you are losing huge amounts of valuable information in that process. So if you're going to do this process of going from aggregation to normalization, you're going to want to use clinical interface terminology and normalize at that higher level of specificity. But next, as I told you before, data as it's collected isn't necessarily data in the right format to be used. And whether it's you're doing analytics for care management or population health, or you're trying to populate a machine learning algorithm, data needs to be transformed. And often that means altering the level of specificity or granularity and grouping together things that might have extremely high levels of specificity for clinical purposes, but don't have high levels of specificity for some of these other things, like you might have a disease registry, for example. And lastly, because of just the total overwhelming amount of data that's now available to us, there really needs to be smart summarization of that data, making that data valuable to the clinician user, and therefore creating a virtuous cycle and improving the quality of the data that's available to us for analytics. And let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean by that. So one example might be diabetes management. And let's say I'm interested in transforming all of the 14,000 different ways that you can actually capture the concept of diabetes within the electronic health record into the concept of diabetes that is necessary to drive, let's say, a decision support rule, like you're supposed to have your hemoglobin A1C checked or your eye examined. So the level of granularity that's relevant for managing a disease registry or for labeling of data, perhaps for machine learning, might be at a level higher than the individual diagnoses that are present in the record. And this is where transformation is really important. An example of summarization might be a patient who comes to me as an internist who needs their gallbladder removed. Now, I'm not going to remove the gallbladder, but I need to clear them for the operation. And I really don't want to review the entire patient's medical record to determine whether or not they're really cleared for surgery. There's really three things that I need to do. I need to make sure that the lungs are okay so that you can take anesthesia, that your heart is not going to fail on the table, and that your blood is appropriately going to coagulate and you're going to heal properly from that procedure, right? So what I want to be able to do is use my analytics and my transformation and grouping to basically pull out just the latest pulmonary function test, the most recent electrocardiogram, and the most recent coagulation studies, so that I can review those and make the call whether the person can go to surgery. But we can go even farther than that, because if there are some really specific cutoffs, like for example, if your platelet count is too low, like below a level of 50 to go to surgery, and the system knows that your platelet count is 30, and it knows that where to look for that because it knows the specific things I'm interested in to clear you for pre-op, then it could automatically give me this red thumbs down and say, guys, you don't need to, you can't go to surgery, you need to do something beforehand. And this dramatically lowers the cognitive burden on the clinicians, and it shows how smart analytics and smart transformation of that data and smart summarization of the data can dramatically improve the care process and me as a provider taking care of the patient. So going back to this sort of data maturity model and these journeys that we're going through, we can imagine that there are key steps along the way, depending on where you and your institution fall, where you can inject higher octane into that data. So you can enhance that initial data capture so that when you are aggregating the data together, that you really do it at the highest level of specificity, and that you're making it easy for the clinicians to interact with those information systems using clinical interface terminology or something similar, right? So that's guaranteeing that the signal coming into this pipe is the best and has the most value to the people collecting that data as it can. And if our goal is ultimately to provide clean, reliable, actionable data to drive insights for whether it's financial or patient outcomes or user satisfaction, what data is going in and how we transform that data is really going to be key. The next step really is that normalization process. And as I mentioned before, normalizing the structured data at the highest level of specificity is really essential. And so if you've lost the data because you've ELT'd it or imported it from a source system and it didn't have all those necessary structural data elements or attributes like that I mentioned before that come out of the clinical interface terminology, they need to be added back so that you can actually have that centralized lingua franca on which you're doing everything else. And this is actually the point in which natural language processing of unstructured data comes in, because it's really important that if you're bringing data from other systems like in the narrative text, that you're coding it in the same level of specificity as the most granular capabilities that you had in the clinical interface terminology. It doesn't make a lot of sense to have all this great clinical data out of the EHR, and then you go to all the narrative text and you're pulling out ICD codes. It's really important that those are all speaking the same language. And then as I mentioned, once the languages, the data is all together in the same language, we can now look at it and we can actually start to apply processes to assess its quality and its cleanliness and its comprehensiveness. And I would point out that, whereas many of us in the analytics space might be quite comfortable with doing data cleansing on our analytics table, we're doing that for our benefit. The people who are in those source systems don't have the benefit of that. And so we need systems that help drive that cleanliness to the point of care. So whether it's problemless management tools or other tools that actually help providers organize their data and clean that data at the source, those are just as important as the kind of cleaning up that we might be doing later in the process to make our analysis tables easier to use. And last, both in that cleansing process of sort of grouping things together to identify duplicate data or perhaps contradictory data, the notion of groupers and value sets, the things that we define and transform our data into, is really the next key step, because not only does that help us figure out whether the data is clean or not, but it also helps us, for example, generate those appropriate registries or care management processes, the right level of specificity to care for patients with a particular stage of cancer as opposed to one stage or another. And then certainly as we start to get into the future where we're using machine learning and artificial intelligence to help take care of patients, that that the way those data get labeled, what those groups are and transformed, are really essential. And you want to be able to do that at the level of specificity necessary that you captured all the way back at the clinical interface terminology. So what I hope I've shared with you is that if we imagine there's this tidal wave of data that is going to come and has already started to crash upon the industry, and that those of us who are managing that data and hopefully trying to ride the wave, surf the wave to get the most impact out of it rather than being dumped under and swamped by it, need to understand this sort of data maturity process, understand the need for transformation and proper summarization and grouping of the data to drive the various use cases that we're talking about. And I hope that you understand after my talk today exactly how clinical interface terminology is really the very first step, laying the foundation for all of the things that we want to do later in that process. And I just want to add some concluding thoughts, because there's a lot of talk about how big data and artificial intelligence is somehow going to solve this problem and replace clinicians. And there's certainly been lots of recent experience, whether it's Watson Health or the Haven Healthcare, where there's been some significant challenges to this idea. And what I'm really trying to say is something different. And that is that if we intelligently collect, aggregate, transform, and summarize data, and do that in a way that can actually be customized to the particular problem we're trying to solve, really being context sensitive around the quality of that data and the questions we want to ask, then what we're doing instead is actually intelligence augmentation. We're basically facilitating the communication that I talked about that was so important about caring for patients, so that we can actually improve their care, as well as improve the quality of life of the clinician. And we do that by really enhancing the underlying data and its fitness for purpose, injecting Octane into our health information system so that our analytics are truly running as high performance engines. So I'll stop there, and I hope I was able to give you a bit of a landscape and the way IMO is sort of viewing this particular challenge. And as we go forward, both with the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as all of the challenges that we continued to have even before that in the healthcare system, this approach to the underlying foundation of data and data quality will help us along the way. So thank you. Anyway, I think we have some time for some questions.
Great. So with that, let's move on to the Q&A. There's still time to submit your questions using the Q&A tab on the left side of your screen. But we have a lot of great questions already, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. So our first question is, what types of health IT projects should organizations prioritize to be the most effective in their interoperability initiatives?
So it's always a good question to ask, and I think IMO comes from a particular perspective over the last 25 years, and what, as a clinician as well, I see that the sort of fundamental challenge that we are doing, or the reason why we're even around, is to solve patients' problems. That's why they come to us, and that's really what our job to do is. And that when we look at the value proposition, starting at the problems or diagnosis level is really one of the most important places to start. Not only, as I mentioned before, it's kind of the center of the patient's sort of healthcare journey, but as we think about the communication role that I talked about as between the team, between the patients, and between myself, it's really going to be around problems. And so thinking about starting with the interoperability, and this is kind of where meaningful use was, why it also focused on things like the problem list, that's a good place to start your interoperability experience. But when you go beyond that, you start to look at some of where the, kind of where the key data challenges are right now. And you might, I noticed that things like laboratory data or medication data is very unlikely to be properly encoded and carry with it the kind of specificity that I just talked about in clinical interface terminology. And so once the problems are in place, looking at how your health systems or your ecosystems are managing and transmitting things around the laboratory and medication side is probably the next place to look.
Great. So our next question is, how does patient data captured and maintained along the clinical workflow impact data integrity and analytics?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of the summary of what the point I was trying to make is that, it's sort of garbage in, garbage out, and that what we really need to do is figure out a way in which our health information systems can actually generate data that's useful for the care of patients. And that up to this point, many of the things that have been driving particular kinds of data collection have either been driven by the financial or reimbursement side of things, or kind of quality measures, which are been relatively process focused and artificial, and not really focused on the kinds of things that that are going to drive patient care. And so if we're able to ensure that the data that we're collecting is actually in the form that's useful for clinicians, it will mean that it's also going to be in the form useful for the analytics side of things.
Okay, so we have a question from someone that has EHR, and they want to know how they can convert to one with CIT.
It's acronym soup. Yeah. So if you're using an EHR now, and it's one of the big ones, you're probably already using IMO, at least for a portion of your data stream. And that maybe the question you want to ask is, well, how are you leveraging that data appropriately, either in your data warehouse or your analytics work stream, and where could CIT really help you out? But if you're not, there's lots of examples where this type of data can be provided, and we currently serve over 129 different EHR vendors right now. So if you're not getting CIT in your system right now, please reach out to IMO, and we'll figure out a way that we can do that for you.
Great. So I think we're going to wrap up here. We did have a lot of great questions, but we couldn't get to them all. But we will try to get back to everyone personally after the webinar. Thank you for attending this Fierce Healthcare webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Intelligent Medical Objects for presenting today's webinar. This webinar has been recorded. You'll be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.